Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Dialogue Out Loud. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Today, we're excited to have with us Bonnie Young, who holds a bachelor's degree in history with an emphasis in Mormon women's history and a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from BYU. Bonnie is pursuing a PhD in marriage and family therapy at Utah State University. In her fascinating article, My Indignation Has Got the Better of Me, a case study in Latter-day Saint and Gentile female family correspondence in 19th-century America, she explores the lives of three sisters in the 19th century. Bonnie, welcome. It's so nice to talk to you about your work.
Thank you. I feel really grateful to be here, Taylor.
So first of all, tell us about these three sisters that you study. Who are they and what do we know about them?
Okay. So yes, like you mentioned in the introduction, we've got Martha Tell Cannon, who was married to George Q. Cannon. And she is the younger half-sister of Sarah Tell King and Tabitha Tell Sykes. And the uniting parent of these sisters is Josiah Tell. And with his first wife, Josiah had Sarah and Tabitha. With that first wife, the family moved to Nauvoo. There, Josiah's first wife, whose name was actually also Tabitha, died of malaria. So then Josiah remarries and has Martha. And at the age of 18 months, so when Martha was just 18 months, her mother tragically died. It was actually a quite bizarre story where the father, Josiah, accidentally shot and killed his wife. And so after the death of the second wife, Josiah's second wife, the family split apart, and Martha moved with her uncle and aunt, who were Latter-day Saints, and the two older sisters, Sarah and Tabitha, went with other relatives back to New York. So Martha really, she ended up being very involved with the Latter-day Saint movement, even though she didn't follow the Saints in their initial trek westward. Her aunt and uncle were very religious, and Martha grew up knowing and really identifying as a Latter-day Saint, whereas her older sisters had a quite tragic experience with the Latter-day Saints, the death of their mother, the death of their stepmother. And although may have been, somewhat, had interactions with Latter-day Saints, never truly identified, were never baptized, never considered themselves Latter-day Saints.
How much older were they than Martha?
Great question. I believe 10-ish years.
So not quite teenagers, but youngish and are old enough to sort of have some impressionable memories from that era.
Yeah, old enough to where, Sarah especially, I believe Sarah was about 12 when her mom died. So Sarah was really at this age of, she knows what's going on, especially as the oldest child. Tabitha, I believe, was just a few years younger than Sarah, so not quite as aware, but had more of a memory than, little 18-month-year-old Martha.
And obviously for their father, a set of tragedies that I'm sure emotionally scarred him as well. He ends up giving up all three of his children as a consequence of these tragedies and sort of falls away from their lives completely for at least a very long time, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. His story is one of tragedy. So it's interesting. One of the reasons, so let me give you a little bit of background. So, right, the sisters split up. They maintain some correspondence until Martha moves west, very determined to be an independent woman. She was a teacher. She graduated from university before she moved west. But she was also really determined to marry into polygamy. She had visited Utah before and really believed this is something that will really benefit me. This will really bless my life. And she also very much believed in the divinity of polygamy. So this is something that she was really committed to. But it wasn't until she actually married polygamously to George Buchanan that her sisters cut off correspondence. And whether, the cutting of their correspondence was due to, I'm not going to communicate with someone who's involved in this, if they thought that maybe they could dissuade their sister from breaking off correspondence, we don't know exactly, but that's where correspondence ended for a very long time, until later when the sisters reached out one of the sisters started to reach out in reconciliation.
So this is in the 1870s. It's not only the sort of low point for the Latter-day Saints in the American consciousness of all of the, drama around that, a kind of major political campaigns that the Republican Party is engaged in against Mormonism, lots of controversy. And of course, as you mentioned, Martha is married to maybe one of the most famous Latter-day Saints of the time, George Buchanan. Can you just tell us a little bit about who he was and why he was so famous in that period?
Yeah. Taylor, you probably know a lot more about him than I do. As my research is mostly just focused on these sisters, but so fill in the gaps for me, please. I very much consider myself a therapist more than a historian, but he was one of the counselors in the first presidency, first or second counselor. Do you know?
At this particular time, I don't know, but he's in the senior leadership.
He was up there. Yeah. And he was also in the government. I believe he was in the Congress in Washington, D.C. So, he was very much face of the church here in Utah, but also abroad. He did lots of interviews, was kind of a public face of the church abroad. So, in fact, it was through him that the oldest sister, Sarah Tell, reached out to restore correspondence with Martha because she knew that he was in Washington, D.C.
So tell us a little bit about the sources that you have for reconstructing these women's lives, their interrelationships with one another. How did you come across these and what do we have?
Yeah. So, and talking about these sources, probably I don't really consider myself a historian, but, original letters just make me giddy. So it was actually in my undergrad, and it was for my capstone paper. And we went down, I think with Chris Hodson, who's at BYU. He was the professor for my capstone. And this is a long time ago. So this has been a work in progress. But we went down to what's it called? In the basement of the library.
Archives.
The archives. There's a special name for it. I'm forgetting.
Special collections.
Special collections. Thank you. And I think the librarian showed us these letters and was like, hey, no one's ever written about these. And these are pretty outstanding. And, my professor knew that I was interested in polygamy and interested in Mormon women's history. So I started digging in. And then I did a lot of my research, on Family Search, actually. Made some connections. I think I looked on Facebook for, so I think what I did is I looked on Family Search. On Family Search, I saw who was putting all this information in about Martha and her sisters, stalked on Facebook to find that family member, and then got even more information. And some of her, these relatives had compiled a lot of information, had even written kind of life sketches, life histories of Martha and her sisters. So there was a lot there that I got to work from.
That's amazing. And also just a testament to the way that new technologies allow us to kind of fill in the gaps sometimes from the archives. And it's cool that you were able to do that. So tell us a little bit about, maybe more in depth about the emotional entanglements that these sisters have. You kind of gave us the sketch outline that they had a falling apart and then an attempted reconciliation. What did their correspondence reveal about the nature of their disagreements and why and how they got back together?
Yeah. I love this question because I find, the process of attempted reconciliation and then actual reconciliation with the two sisters, which is really beautiful in telling about the human experience. So like I mentioned, and I know, these sisters' names might be confusing to listeners. So we have the oldest sisters are Sarah and Tabitha, and then the younger sister, the Mormon polygamous sister, is Martha. So Sarah reaches out first. So the oldest sister reaches out first. And Sarah reaches out to Martha through George in Washington, D.C., asking about the family, asking about genealogy, just wanting to get a little bit more information. The sisters also had some brothers that kind of seems like they were wanderers, and they wanted to get, what's the update on our brothers? But in the correspondence between Sarah and Martha, there was kind of this moment that I think was maybe in therapy what we would call like an attachment injury. It was just kind of this block. It was this moment when I think the pain of both sisters was just, so apparent. And I believe what happened is Sarah asked, I think Sarah couldn't really get past, even though she was very much disagreed with Martha's lifestyle, I also think she was very curious, like, what is your life like out there? Kind of like this, don't tell me, but tell me kind of thing. So she asked Martha, tell me about your life out there. And then Martha responds, and we don't have that response. We don't have that letter. So we're filling in the blanks from, other letters that do exist. But what we found is that Martha probably responded with, what she would probably call her testimony, right? Of this is how I live, and I believe it's right, and it's divine. And whether it kind of bordered on evangelism, like, maybe Sarah was like, whoa, you do not go there. Or whether it was just more simple, Sarah experienced it kind of as just too much. And Sarah's response to Martha's information about her lifestyle was biting. I mean, it was an attack. She said, there's lots of personal digs on Martha's religion, on her morality, and after that response, or after that kind of attack on Martha didn't respond for a really long time. And eventually those sisters tried to reconcile. I think I'm mixing up the sisters. Sarah sent more letters to Martha like, hey, like, let's still maintain correspondence. But I think for Martha, it was just too painful. And so eventually she blames, not responding to Sarah on babies and housework, which, I think we know if it was really important to her, she probably could have made time to respond to her sister. I think it was just too much emotional pain. But, upon a little bit more examination of the letter, right, we don't attacks normally are born, like emotional attacks. So whether we're talking about these letters or we're talking about, relationships with spouses or partners, attacks on other people normally are born from pain that we're feeling, like these really core pains that motivate us. And what the letters showed that was for Sarah was so much pain in her life had come from her relationship and her family's relationship with the Latter-day Saints. And she talks about this in her letter. Her father was swindled, as she puts it, out of money, giving $1,000 to Joe Smith that he never intended to repay. That's what she says. The death of their mother, of malaria, and then the death of her stepmother, also with the Saints. I think for Sarah, it was just too much. And at such, kind of, as we mentioned before, at such a crucial age, around 12, where she's taking this all in. I think that pain for her was just too much to overcome. And especially to a sister who was probably unaware or not willing to accept that pain could exist, that the church, wasn't perfect, that everything wasn't, rainbows and ponies in Nauvoo. So that was the experience of Sarah. Really, her pain really manifested in the exchange between her and Martha. Whereas we see a really different story with Tabitha, whether it's because of maybe a set of personality traits that she inherited, maybe a willingness to maybe more psychological flexibility, or because she didn't have the same trauma that her older sister had because of her age. We're able to see Tabitha, and also Tabitha's daughter, Annie, kind of comes in the correspondence here as well. We're able to see them correspond with Martha in a way that acknowledges our differences. Like, yeah, you live polygamously. They know that Martha is living with George even after, polygamy was announced to be ended. They were probably even aware there was a point when, and I forget what year it was, when George Cannon was interviewed in DC about continued marriages in Mexico, I believe, even after the manifesto had been announced. And those sisters were probably aware, like, oh, our brother-in-law just said something really big about, polygamy is continuing. And still, even after that, the correspondence continues being very warm. But one difference we see in the correspondence between Tabitha, so this is the second sister, younger than Sarah, and Martha, is they acknowledge Martha's pain. They acknowledge, wow, during the raids, what would it be like to be with your children in hiding? What would it be like to be ripped away from your family? And then when George dies, they express their condolences. What would it be like to have a life partner gone, right? And their pain of losing loved ones, they can use that to connect. And so a very different emotional experience in these two letters of attempted and, successful reconciliation.
Reading these, it felt so familiar as both, stories about families who have deep religious divides, right? On the one hand, some who are deeply committed to the religion, and on the other, some who are deeply angry at it for pains that it has caused them, or that they perceive that it's caused them. And so there was something that felt very familiar to that. But I'm wondering for you, why do you think that historians should pay attention to stories like these? And why were you drawn to these stories as a historian?
Yeah. I was drawn to these stories right. I just feel like letters are just letters that weren't meant to be read by anyone else. Letters that were just meant from my sister's eyes only, right? I just feel like they give us a level of intimacy that we don't get from other records, except maybe journals. But so I think the reason I was drawn to these letters is like, ooh, I'm getting let in on this relationship between sisters, and I have sisters, and there's something that's just really special about, or can be really special, also can go the other way too, relationships between sisters, kind of these feminine relationships where we talk about our experiences differently with our sisters than we do with brothers or other people. So I think that's why I was drawn to them. I think I was also drawn to them because these sisters were so different. And like you mentioned, that's just kind of the reality today for, whether you're both consider yourself Orthodox or one has stayed in the church and one has left, right? There are so many differences that we can encounter. So that's why I was drawn to them, and why I think that historians need to pay attention to this. I just think it gives richness. I think it gives texture. And I think when we can read things like this and put them in the broader context, right, of what was going on historically, politically, I think kind of going down to the macro level, going down to the micro level, not staying at the macro level, I think can just make history feel a little bit more personal, like it really applies to me. So it's not just I'm reading these facts and, oh, this happened politically, but it's how can I see myself in this? And I think that in that way, reading, participating in history can be kind of healing. You can maybe confront yourself in some important ways. How might I be like Martha in defending the church at all costs? Or how might I be like Sarah in attacking the church or other people's beliefs? And my pain is getting in the way of me being able to see them truthfully.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Bonnie. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show to talk more about your research. We hope that our listeners have enjoyed the conversation and have learned something new about 19th century women's lives. If you'd like to learn more, please check out Bonnie Young. My Indignation Has Got the Better of My Intention, a case study in Latter-day Saint and Gentile female family correspondence in 19th century America, in the summer 2023 issue of Dialogue, and explore other resources on this topic there. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in for future episodes of our podcast. Please subscribe and rate the show, and check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Andrew Hall, host of the Dialogue Book Report. Each episode features brilliant minds from the world of Mormon publishing. One thing we like to do is, instead of focusing on a single guest, we like to bring in 2 or more guests who are working in similar fields and put their works in conversation with each other. Recently, we brought in Michael Austin and Stephen Carter, 2 of the leading cultural commentators of Mormonism in the 21st century, and had them talk about their recent biographies of 2 of the great minds of the 20th century, Vardis Fisher and Virginia Sorensen. You can subscribe to all of the Dialogue Journal podcasts by going to dialoguejournal.com and check out all of our past episodes.
Dialogue Podcast Network.